The category is What the Trans Darlings.
Well, greetings and salutations and hello and welcome to What the Trans.
What the Trans.
Yes, indeed, yet another episode of everybody's second or third favourite trans podcast. How are you, Michelle?
I'm fine. I have nothing to report because my entire week has mostly been reading news and playing The Last of Us Part 2.
Very nice.
And we're going to talk about the news in a bit.
Yes.
So I could tell you about The Last of Us Part 2 if you like.
I hear it's not the most cheerful game series.
No, it's very sad, but it has a trans person in it, and he is by far the least sad and best person in it by miles.
Nice.
And I'm into that.
Yeah, that's how it should be, really.
Yeah, and the whole game is essentially... I don't know if this counts as a spoiler, because they don't really say this, but it's definitely a thing. The whole thing is about how violence is really bad and leads to more violence, so maybe you shouldn't do it. But it does really interesting things where the game, you kind of have to commit violence to get through it, but then, like, in other games, you kill someone, right, and you leave their body somewhere. And, like, a guard will come along and find the body and be like, oh no, we've got an intruder. Whereas in The Last of Us Part 2, they'll yell things up like, Thomas, no! And, you know, cry.
Yeah.
Because they actually quite like the person that you murdered. And then you feel bad. And you feel worse when a dog runs at you, going to bite your neck off. So you put a knife in its head and you kill it. But then later on, you hear the owner find the dog and go, oh no, Pebbles, no!
Oh.
Yeah, so, and you feel bad even though that dog was trying to bite your neck off. Yeah.
You still feel bad for it.
Yeah, so it's one of those games that definitely makes you feel like violence is bad and you see the consequences of it and it sucks and it makes you not want to be violent in other video games.
That's fair.
So that's been my week. How about you? What have you been doing?
I've been replaying BioShock. So that's good.
We've been playing our arty games. We've been getting a little bit
Yes.
pretentious with our gaming, dare I say it, this week.
Yes, indeed. BioShock's old now. It came out in the early 2000s. BioShock is going to be nearly 20 years old now.
Yeah, for people who don't know, BioShock is a game about a really rich guy who read way too much Ayn Rand and made a horrible, horrible objectivist nightmare place under the sea for people to live in. And of course it all goes horribly wrong, because if you let capitalism just go without any restraints whatsoever, it turns into a horrible shit show. But yeah, do continue. What have you been doing in BioShock?
Well, trying to sneak through and not get in too many fights, but even now, I'm still fairly early game, but I've reached the point where I'm fairly overpowered now.
Can you fly bees out of your fists? Have you got that power?
Not yet, but it's coming. I can just light people on fire and zap them with electricity and then hit them, smack them with a wrench or fire a shotgun at them. There's just so many options.
And you feel good at doing it because you are actively fighting the ideology of Ayn Rand, objectivism.
Yes.
Or
yes,
you're
indeed.
fighting a lot of metaphors for that.
Yeah, well, the guy's name, the leader, quote-unquote, of Rapture is Andrew Ryan, and obviously that's a rearrangement of Ayn Rand plus another couple of letters. Yeah, it's super good. If you've not played it, I would suggest give it a go. It's good fun. You have superpowers and weapons, and it's great. What else have I been doing that isn't that? We have done some baking this week. What else? I'm trying to think, actually. Most of the time, when I'm not swanning off to London to watch plays, I actually have quite a boring life, particularly in a week where the MS pain is bad, which is most weeks, if we're honest. Anyway, we are here to do this thing, What We Do, and which you, dear listener, looking very stylish today, if I may say, that our lovely listeners have come to know and tolerate, which is, the first segment is, of course, not the news.
Oh, we're doing the news again?
Yeah, maybe just this once, maybe we'll ditch it next time.
Yeah, maybe.
But it has kind of become our brand, we're the Trans News Podcast, of the UK at least. what fun times the UK is currently experiencing as well. Because if you go back and listen to our most recent episode, where we're talking about the incoming regime of Prime Minister Liz Truss, well,
I did say on the last episode,
got some news for you.
But this may not be true by the time next time we record, because things appear to be in flux, and they are, because, well, we're going to start the news today with a fairly new segment of our podcast called Who is the Prime Minister Today? And at time of recording, that person is now Rishi Sunak, after Liz Truss famously shit the bed so hard she was forced to quit being Prime Minister after 50 days, where she almost single-handedly added hundreds to many people's mortgages and made it really clear that she didn't have a fucking clue what she was doing at any stage of her career. So since the Conservatives took power in 2010, they've treated us to 5 different Prime Ministers, which is nice, all of whom have been included in debates over who is the worst Prime Minister of all time.
Yes, indeed.
All of them.
Yes, every single one.
David Cameron because of the Brexit stuff. Theresa May because she couldn't get anything done. Boris Johnson because he lied and broke all the laws. And
he's Boris Johnson.
Apparently a very charming crypto-fascist.
Yes.
Liz Truss, who did last 2 months, which I find fucking hilarious and also terrifying.
Shortest prime ministerial appointment in British history. So let's see if we can, get through Rishi in a fortnight, and then he gets that honour as well.
For those who may have been avoiding all news over the past few years, Sunak started as the Conservative MP for prime Tory safe seat in Richmond, where he was parachuted in. Because he was born and raised in Southampton, he was parachuted in to take over from former Tory leader William Hague in 2015, almost certainly because the Conservative Party saw him as a potential rising star. And since then, he has been accumulating all sorts of experience in the Cabinet Office with a number of high-profile roles, but rose to real, true national prominence when he was elevated to Chancellor under Boris Johnson during the first years of COVID, where he was found to have broken COVID lockdown restrictions and was issued with a fixed penalty notice by the police along with 82 others, including the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So we now have our second Prime Minister who has a criminal record, which is really impressive for those kinds of people, because these kind of people who are really rich and wealthy and all of that and privileged don't tend to get criminal records because their crimes are legal. But yeah, they really shit the bed on that one. Rishi Sunak subsequently quit being Boris Johnson's Chancellor, and along with Sajid Javid and many others, started many months of leadership contests and rebellions and bullshit and uncertainty over who the hell was going to run the country. So he stood in the leadership contest after Boris Johnson resigned, and he stood against Liz Truss and others. And during that, he made it repeatedly clear where he stood on trans issues, along with all the other candidates, which was repeatedly saying, all the way through August, that trans women are not women, and saying that he would tackle quote-unquote clumsy language concerning gender stuff, and how that is taught to children. And he questioned whether trans women should be allowed to play women's sport, and tried to tell anyone who would listen that he is officially anti-woke. So, that sounds great. But that leadership contest ended with Liz Truss being the victor and crowned Prime Minister. But then we all know how that turned out, because I've said it like twice already. So MPs very quickly pushed Truss out recently into quitting, and they installed Sunak instead. This time there was no vote amongst Conservative members. It was a straight thing from the MPs. The MPs were just like, right, Truss is gone, Sunak is in. So that kind of raises questions about democracy and everything else, but there's a lot to get through, so let's just keep going. But there were questions at the time as to how serious Sunak was about the transphobia and everything else he was churning. And there were maybe he was just feeding chum to the hard right of the Tory party. Maybe that was a possibility. Maybe it was just him saying whatever he needed to say in the face of an incredibly transphobic and obsessed national press, and it's going to be okay.
Maybe.
Well, probably not.
Yeah.
Because all signs are pointing towards him being very fucking serious. Looking at who he has appointed to his cabinet, it is safe to say that whilst trans issues will not be the Sunak government's main focus, because economy, but with these pricks that Sunak has picked, and based on what they have said and done over the last few years, who the hell knows what's going to happen? Starting off, there is Suella Braverman, who only just resigned as Home Secretary just before Liz Truss actually quit, who Sunak has asked to come back as Home Secretary, after recently it was reported all over the press that Braverman has allegedly breached the minister's code multiple times and has apparently a bit of a habit for leaking sensitive data that has apparently made British spies unwilling to talk to her.
Yes.
That's a thing being reported right now. So maybe she won't be in a job by the next episode. We'll see. But right now, at the time of recording, Braverman is still Home Secretary and has been incredibly vocal on how she thinks trans anything is bad and crap and dangerous. Considering the role of Home Secretary includes managing how laws are enforced in the UK, it's safe to say that she is in a powerful position to act on her anti-trans crap, as well as her racist crap and all the other crap that makes up the crap tower that is Suella Braverman. But alongside her we have Kemi Badenoch, who regular listeners will have heard her name before. She's been made the Secretary of State for International Trade and the Minister for Women and Equalities, which is a very important position when it comes to trans people in the UK. The Minister for Women and Equalities is the post in Cabinet that sorts out equality law, and so it is very important that you have someone who understands equality issues, understands the struggles minorities face in the UK today. In September 2021, Vice News' Ben Hunt revealed that Kemi Badenoch had been caught on tape questioning LGBT equality, specifically mocking the idea of trans women, calling trans women men, and basically totally not understanding equality issues or the struggles minorities can face. Later that same month, Badenoch also claimed in a WhatsApp message obtained by Vice News that she did not care about colonialism. And in July of this year, once again, through Ben Hunt at Vice News, they revealed that Badenoch had actually written to the Financial Conduct Authority urging them to rethink their trans-inclusive plans for their trans employees, and as a result, the Financial Conduct Authority dropped their plans. It is very, very safe to say that Sunak has picked one of, if not the most anti-trans person in the Conservative Party to run the Government Equalities Office.
Hooray!
So, sounds like they got the right person for the job.
Yeah, the Inequalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, was just... It was astonishing because the leadership race was happening while I was in hospital, which I've talked about at length in previous episodes.
Yeah.
But when Kemi Badenoch was the candidate of choice for Britain First, right? So Britain First are so anti-woke, are so committed to standing against progress and equality that they literally told their incredibly racist members to vote for a black woman because of her anti-woke stance. And when Britain First are the people supporting you, that's not a good sign.
I mean, it's not hyperbole to say, or Godwin's, I don't think, to say that they are Nazi-ish. They're definitely fascist.
Definitely given the other picks for the cabinet as well, which, go on, I'll let you read out the roll call of shame for these people.
Oh, that's right, because that's... Kemi Badenoch is not all. When it comes to the cabinet Sunak has selected, he has a collection of anti-trans, anti-equality, anti-human being appointments, including Dominic Raab, James Cleverly, Nadeem Zahawi, Michael Gove, David T.C. Davies, and Robert Jenrick, all of whom have either been very public in how they think trans people are bullshit, or have actively worked, in the case of Robert Jenrick, and to a lesser extent David T.C. Davies, actively worked on trying to create anti-trans legislation in their various roles. So this is probably the most anti-trans cabinet we have ever seen, which is saying something considering how long What the Trans has been around and how many prime ministers we've seen in that time.
Yes, quite.
And it's saying a lot because it's not like Truss and Johnson's cabinets were packed with allies. In fact, they may have been just as bad. But the response from folks in the LGBT community has been pretty unanimous in their disgust at all of this.
Yes.
All of the usual groups that you would expect came out with a statement saying this is nonsense. And Patrick Strudwick for iNews wrote that we LGBT people are now left in the brace position because as this government inevitably fails to protect people from poverty and hunger, it will seize upon scapegoats as a distraction. You'll notice that is something that I have said on this podcast before many times because it's pretty bloody obvious.
Yes.
But he's very right. You should check the link in the description for that and everything else. But yeah, what do you think of all of this? How do you feel about the leadership of our great, glorious nation?
Yeah, I think we're well beyond great and glorious and are now in, embattled and self-hating, I think, because, the will of the British people is essentially turkeys voting for Christmas.
Yeah.
I feel. So it's just... It's so dispiriting, but it's also not very surprising because I was astonished to hear about David T.C. Davis, because he has been one of the most consistently anti-trans voices. And while I'm not sure if he's asked anything at PMQs, he has helped set up events for, was it Woman's Place UK or Man Friday, or one of those turf groups.
Yeah, he got a bunch of bellends in the Commons to speak a load of shit a few times. He's done that.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's now in the cabinet, a man who seems to be so opposed to the truth he would probably bounce straight off it. A fucking Kemi Badenoch, because we've, going back on the podcast months at least, have spoken of Kemi Badenoch as the inequalities minister, because that's exactly what she is. And it's interesting that she's now got the same portfolio that Truss had in the Johnson government, whereby she is the Minister for International Trade and also Women and Equalities. They're not viewing women and equalities as something that requires its own minister. It's just shoveled on the back end of international trade. And just... fuck these people. Fuck these awful people.
So, amongst the many prominent members of the LGBT community who came out and said this cabinet is bullshit, in different words than that, was Ben Cohen, the CEO of Pink News. He was one of many, but then his criticism got brought up in Parliament, where Kemi Badenoch immediately went on the attack, claiming that he uses his Twitter account to spread defamation and nonsense. Which, I mean, Ben Cohen can rub people up the wrong way. That is a thing that he is capable of doing, but I don't think he's ever done that.
Indeed.
Like, there is a wide sway of opinion on Ben. He's pretty cool, I think. I worked for him for a bit and he was okay. But, he's just a person. And she made him out to be like this absolute troll-like terror because... And this isn't the first time that she has come after essentially journalists. Like, there's a time where she went after Nadine White for The Independent many months ago because Nadine White, as a reporter, asked her a question over email. And Badenoch's response was to just tweet out that she was being harassed by Nadine White, which is a curious thing to do to a journalist who's emailing a minister in the government.
And asking a question, as journalists are wont to do.
Yeah. So, some people have taken this as like a sign that Badenoch is, a fascist because she's clearly got an issue with the press and is more likely to go on the attack than anything else. But I don't know. I just think it really, really annoys her. So maybe more people should do it.
Yeah, I agree. It's like, for a government like this, I kind of feel like it's everyone's duty to try and shove something in the spokes. Spanner in the works, etc.
Yeah, so here's my go. I'll try to put a thing in the spokes right here and say that Kemi Badenoch is a homophobe and a transphobe because of the things she has been caught on tape saying and because of the actual things she has been doing.
Yes. So, in all of the ways that matter, really, she is a homophobe and a transphobe.
Yes.
As she has made quite clear on, I feel, more than one occasion, as we have detailed. And now this person is our Equalities Minister. And it's just...
Yeah. A few months ago when... two Prime Ministers ago, I should say, I said the chances of there being explicit anti-trans legislation being introduced into Parliament in the next 2 years was low to zero because they didn't really have anything massively proposed or promised in their manifesto, and it looked like they were going to be pretty busy. But now, I have no fucking idea what's going to happen next. I have no idea, because we've had so many different prime ministers at different points. I'm not entirely sure who has a mandate to rule or not. Like, arguably, none of them have had any kind of mandate to rule since Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
Because he actually won an election.
He did, somehow.
Yeah, which none of the other prime ministers since, well, both of them, have actually done yet. So I don't know if that means that all of the legislation that's in process is going to vanish now because it's a new prime minister again. It's a new session of Parliament. I don't know what he's going to introduce. I have no idea. So maybe there could be an anti-trans legislation on the way. It sounds like, with everything he's been saying, that could point that way. And with this cabinet, you know that there's a will. They've basically made it very clear that they like to chase headlines, and they like to chase positive headlines, and a way to get positive headlines in our shithouse press is to be shitty to trans people. So, who the fuck knows what's going to happen next? Because I don't. And anyone who says they do is lying.
Yeah, pretty much.
Nobody can predict what the fuck's going to happen. But I think I can safely predict that at the very, very least, we're going to be coming back on here, Ashley, over the coming months, repeatedly, to talk about the bullshit and horrible nonsense that some minister has said about trans people. I think that's the only prediction I could even make, and be sure I wouldn't lose any money on it.
It sounds like a pretty safe bet to me. Yes, won't that be fun?
I'll be a fucking riot. I love it. But we got some more...
We do have some more news, yes.
Bad news?
I mean...
Maybe?
It's not specifically good, and in a sense it's more of the same, because we just can't resist on this podcast just banging the drum of holy shit, the British press is obsessive.
Yeah.
So, of course, anybody who's lived in the UK for any amount of time recently, there is the anti-trans crusade in the media, which is delightful, and there is a large focus within this quote-unquote crusade with reference to trans young people. So, on to the next thing, which surrounds trans youngsters and trans kids, and where the hell are they going to get healthcare and how? So, as was announced a few months back, the UK's only NHS gender identity clinic for the under 18s, the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, announced that they would be closing and would be replaced by something else. Now, this came after the release of an interim report commissioned by the NHS itself and from the Cass Review, that specifically outlined how one single clinic lacked the ability to scale to rising demands as well as address a lack of peer-reviewed evidence. Now, the press broadly did not report it that way, choosing instead to portray the closure as a sign that trans healthcare for young people itself is bad and dangerous and experimental. Now, this resulted in the lead of the Cass Review, Dr. Hilary Cass herself, writing a blog entitled Beyond the Headlines to address this. But, of course, barely anybody in the press actually read that, because why would they? Now, the NHS has launched a public consultation asking what everyone thinks of a new proposed service specification for the clinics that will seek to replace GIDS in the short term. The NHS regularly makes service specifications for their services, and putting these specs out to a public consultation is not uncommon. But what is uncommon, and you can probably guess what it is the press absolutely losing their shit over these fairly mundane documents. And the press have really been going to town over this. And the response from them has been alarming. Yeah? So the Mail claimed that this specification meant that the NHS have announced that children who think they're trans are probably just going through a phase, NHS says, which is not what they said. They also, in another report, claimed that doctors will no longer encourage gender-curious children to use preferred pronouns or dress as opposite sex under NHS guidelines, which they also didn't say that. And yet another report about the same bloody thing reported that doctors might have to alert police if trans children are taking puberty blockers bought online in crackdown sparked by Tavistock chaos, which also isn't true. So how much of all this stuff is actually true? Well, that's...
Actually, half of those things is true.
But yeah, well, maybe, but not the way they've said it.
Yeah. Basically. That, yeah.
Yeah, like, fine, they are very, very good at deliberately getting the wrong end of the stick and then trying to hit the person they're interviewing with it.
Yeah, that's their move. That's what they do.
That's how it rolls. So it is complicated. The short version is they are slightly right, but they're also very, very fucking wrong, which is standard Daily Fail stuff, really. So this new service specification, which we have a link to on our website, you can find the link in the description as usual, has got three main areas of concern. The first is that the specification does say that research suggests that most youths who are gender incongruent in some way before puberty will desist in some way. much like the Mail reported, but what they left out was that the NHS service specification references the Endocrine Society's clinical practice guideline from 2017, which stated, and I quote, "With current knowledge, we cannot predict the psychosexual outcome for any specific child. Prospective follow-up studies show that childhood GD/gender incongruence does not invariably persist into adolescence and adulthood, so-called desisters. Combining all outcome studies to date, the gender incongruence of a minority of prepubertal children appears to persist in adolescence. In adolescence, a significant number of these desisters identify as homosexual or bisexual, and it may be that children who only showed some gender nonconforming characteristics have been included in the follow-up studies because the DSM-4 text revision criteria diagnosis were rather broad." So the root of the story is true. Sort of, but the reality is really complicated because, like the CAS interim review pointed out, some of the studies on how transitioning and everything else works out for trans people in the long term show that overall the data could be a lot better. There needs to be more real studies done into this for evidence that they will be happy with. But the press have now run with the idea that the NHS has officially announced that being trans is a phase, which is just, it's a big leap, and it's sort of baffling, but it's also very much not. Now, the second area of concern claims that this new service specification would stop doctors from encouraging social transition, but this one just isn't true at all. The service specification itself states, in summary, for prepubertal children, the clinical approach and advice applied by the service will be supportive and non-judgmental, balancing on a case-by-case basis. A watchful approach overall, with a more individualized approach in cases where the child's level of global functioning may be maintained or improved through a carefully observed process of exploration of social transition. So does that sound like this is stopping doctors from doing anything? And the final thing that the Mail reported about how there was to be some crackdown on young people getting hormones from unregulated sources and unregulated providers, but this came from the following passage in the specification. In such cases, the service will make the child or young person and their family aware of the risks, the contraindications, and any irreversible or partly reversible side effects of the drugs, and will advise the GP to initiate local safeguarding protocols. Now, those last words, initiate local safeguarding protocols, could mean the GP contacting a social worker or other healthcare practitioners or even the police. But that isn't all that's causing concern amongst trans people within this service specification. The number of people who will be allowed to refer young people to these new services will be reduced from those who work with children, such as teachers, to just doctors and those who work in the NHS. This could well mean that it becomes even harder to get a referral at all. And also, maybe the biggest concern we have seen over this comes from this section of the spec. Surrounding the use of hormone treatments, NHS England is in the process of forming proposals for prospectively enrolling children and young people being considered for hormone treatment into a formal research programme with adequate follow-up into adulthood, with a more immediate focus on the questions concerning puberty blockers. On this basis, NHS England will only commission puberty blockers in the context of a formal research protocol. The research protocol will set out eligibility criteria for participation. So what that is saying is they won't do puberty blockers or HRT unless it is part of this research project. There is no other information on what this means, and this has caused fears that the service needed by trans youths will be put behind yet another barrier. So the press were, of course, very over the top about all of these things, but the truth is, the drafted service specification does have quite a lot going on in it that is cause for alarm, just not in the way that the Mail thinks there is. However, as I mentioned right at the beginning, this is part of a consultation. So you yourself can read this and have your own say, and we strongly encourage you to do so. If you didn't like the sound of what is being proposed, you can scroll down to the episode description of this very podcast to find all of the links required, some good information, and the link to the consultation to have your say, which you can do until December the 4th. Oh, so what do we think of that, Michelle?
There's a lot I don't know. I've heard and talked to some people who have made some claims that this service specification shows signs of the NHS moving towards a trying to stop trans kids from being trans pathway, I guess.
Gatekeep until desistance.
Yeah, and I don't know if that is the case or not. I don't know what this service will be based on this specification, because a lot of it is very, very vague, and a lot of it is using terms I don't necessarily understand, and it's very different from the last GID service specification, which that was like around 60 odd pages. This one was around 27 pages. So there's a lot less detail in it about how this is going to work. So when it comes to questions as to what does it look like if a GP is informed of a safeguarding issue around some kid who got their blockers from Gender GP or whatever, you know, what does that look like? I have no goddamn idea. I have no idea about what the service is going to look like based on this. But what I do know is that the NHS didn't announce that being trans is a phase.
They did not.
Like the Mail claimed.
Yeah.
The Mail, and they didn't claim that because if they'd actually read the source of where the NHS made that claim in a specification, they would have read this and come to the same conclusion that I have. Basically, I don't know how this is going to shake out when it shakes out, but what I do know is that the Endocrine Society wouldn't recommend giving out puberty blockers and hormone treatments to trans youths if they fully believed that it was likely to cause more harm than good, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I got that impression from reading the whole bloody thing, which doesn't sound like anyone in the press bloody did. But yeah, I think this specification is going to cause alarm in the trans community because...
I mean, it already has,
hasn't it? It already has, and will probably do more. Because when you read through it, there are times when I was reading through it and my eyebrows raised, just like, hang on, they're going to make all of the kids that want blockers sign up to be some part of some research project. Like, what does that mean? Are there going to be kids who need the treatment who are going to be turned down? I mean, that's where the brain goes, but we don't...
I mean, depending on the type of trial it is, there's the possibility, if they're doing like a double-blind control trial with a placebo, that some kids who need the puberty blockers are in fact given a placebo because it's a research project. I don't think that they would do that because that is super unethical, but then equally, maybe they would do that because this is trans people and it is super unethical. So...
Well, yeah, that's the problem at the moment. The document is so brief, and I suspect it was written with the aim of trying to not cause a media shitstorm, which it too late on that one.
Yeah, a little bit.
So, honestly, I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know how much people should be panicked or alarmed, but I know that these things don't sound necessarily very good, you know? So maybe everyone listening should give a read of the service specification and maybe respond to the consultation, because you know damn well that every single anti-trans wanker in the world is going to be getting in on this. I have a feeling this is going to be maybe one of the most responded to consultations in the NHS's history, because every fucking thing with trans in it gets inundated with everything. Like, everyone wants a fucking piece.
Yeah.
So yeah, go to the description, check out the service specification for yourself, and do respond to the consultation if you have issues with it. That is the big takeaway from this segment, damn it. That needs to happen.
Yep, we really cannot stress that enough.
Yeah, so on to some better news, some actual good news.
We don't get to do that very often.
No, we do not, but let's get through this. So for the last 5 years, Gender Recognition Act reform has been promised by Scottish governments. It has had widespread support across the whole of the Scottish Parliament, but after several long consultations, COVID-19, and other various things, the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill has finally made it to the Scottish Parliament, and it just got past its first hurdle. The Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill proposes to change the gender recognition process for those in Scotland, and only in Scotland, to a far less intrusive and shitty process when it comes to getting your hands on a sweet, sweet gender recognition certificate. Currently, the process for everyone in the United Kingdom involves gaining a diagnosis for gender dysphoria, living in role for 2 years, whatever the hell that means, gaining a statutory declaration, providing mountains of evidence to a panel that you never meet, and only trans men, trans women, and those who are over 18 can actually do it. The Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill currently proposes to change this so there is no diagnosis requirement The time living in role is reduced from 2 years to 3 months, with another added 3 months on top as a reflection period, with the goal of giving folks time to change their mind. Filling in one form instead of sending off loads of evidence, lowering the age limit to 16 plus, and creating a new legal offence, or maybe a few legal offences, for lying during the application process, or lying during the statutory declaration. Non-binary recognition was initially planned to be included, but was later dropped. So this is still just going to be a trans men, trans women deal, but it'll be a bit easier for them. The bill, predictably, has whipped up an utter whirlwind of bullshit, just like it did in 2017 when England and Wales were talking about moving towards this kind of model. I think that many people listening will remember that. That was a fun time. That was a really fun time to have just have started a fucking trans news podcast. But yeah, the UK government has made it clear that it is not fond of what the Scottish Parliament are doing, and the EHRC has actively intervened, demanding the process be slowed down. But Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, has appeared pretty determined to get this through, despite very high-profile bullshit from J.K. Rowling and the UK press. But this high-profile bullshit did not stop the bill sailing through its first test in Parliament yesterday, at the time of recording, where 88 MSPs voted in favour, with 33 against and 4 abstaining. This does not mean that the bill has become law yet. The Scottish Parliament goes through 3 different stages when it comes to legislation going through Parliament. The first stage is deciding whether the bill should go through to the next stages, and that is what just happened. The next for the bill will be stage 2, where MSPs debate and add and remove amendments to the bill and make changes, before holding a final debate and vote in stage 3. There is currently no timeline on when these things will happen. So that is where the bill has come from and how it is doing now. But where is the bill going? The biggest hurdles may be yet to come, as the amendment stage is where every anti-trans wanker in the Scottish Parliament will try to water down or kill the bill entirely with shitty amendments, much like we have seen Lord Blencathra and Baroness Nicholson try in Westminster. The road ahead may be rocky, but considering how popular this bill has proven with MSPs as it stands, it's looking pretty good. What do you think, Ash? What do you think of all of this?
I really wish I could move to Scotland, to be honest, because they're just getting so many things right that the quote-unquote government in Westminster just isn't, really. They're too busy fighting each other and blaming Labour for the sore state of the economy, which they've been in charge of for the last 12 years. But it's somehow Labour's fault, except now we're moving to it's the trans' fault, and Scotland is doing the reasonable thing that any civilised society would do and saying, yeah, actually trans people are people and are worthy of respect. So, crazy thing, but it's a new idea and we figure we'll give it a try. Honestly, I hope this bill goes through. I hope the anti-trans nightmare fucks in the Scottish Parliament have their asses thoroughly handed to them, but we shall see. But honestly, go Scotland.
Yeah.
Nailing it in a way that England never will. So
yeah, there are of course some things that Scottish trans people have pointed to as problematic in the bill as it stands. The 3-month reflection period, which seems to be seen by Scottish trans people as another barrier put in people's way at the behest of cis people who are very afraid of somebody making some kind of mistake.
Yes, indeed.
And also the lack
of non-binary recognition, yeah.
And the lack of recognition for those under 16. Those are issues that have annoyed some trans people in Scotland.
Justifiably so.
On the other side of things, there has also been a lot of trans people desperate for this, because GRA reform is not nothing for a bunch of people, you know? It's not nothing. It's a big thing. But then there are other people who will argue that healthcare is more important, all this other stuff. I don't want to get into whether it's right or wrong that the Scottish government are choosing this as a priority when it comes to trans people or not. What I would like to get onto really is just how it was actually good to see something kind of go a bit right. Not entirely, but, you know, it went a bit right.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm not being as appreciative as I should be, but I find myself thinking, well, this is going to be a good thing. But for maybe half the community in Scotland, maybe.
It's not a very big step. It is kind of a step in the right direction, but yes, there's some fairly basic gimmies that they've decided to step away from. That conceivably is a respectability politics thing, like, you know, we don't want those weird non-binaries with us, and it's like, oh, for goodness sake.
Yeah, I believe the reason it was dropped was because they couldn't figure out a way to make it work with passports and international travel and other stuff. I didn't have that confirmed, so I didn't put it in the script, but that's something I've heard, and that make some sense, because by the sounds of the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Greens, who are in a sort of coalition with each other, it's not an official coalition, but it is a power-sharing agreement, they have been very determined to make this happen ever since they entered into their shared power agreement a few months ago. So I would find it hard to believe that they dropped non-binary recognition and other things related to that because they fucking hate non-binary people. I think it's one of those things where in politics some things tend to fall by the wayside.
Yes, indeed.
For reasons outside of that. But I don't know for sure. The press have been reporting on the vote, which sounds very conclusive, but something like 15 SNP MSPs voted against or abstained, and a government minister quit. SNP Minister Ash Regan ended up resigning over the issue because the SNPs whipped the Parliament, which basically meant, right, all of you SNP MSPs, you're going to vote yes on this or else. And Ash Regan was like, I can't vote yes on this, so I'm quitting the government.
Well, bye. Don't let the door hit you.
It's been reported as the biggest rebellion in Scottish parliamentary history, but it was like 15 people.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like that many. Really.
The vast majority of the Parliament voted in favour of this by a country mile. And that's a good thing, I think. Maybe there's more work to be done, but yeah, overall I think this is good. But yeah, you should absolutely go to the description of this and check out the speech, which I will link to, made by Emma Roddick, an SNP MSP, who she really nailed it. What is your take on GRA reform in general, Ash? Are you for it? Or do you have issues? What do you think?
Well, in a sense, for a long time, in all of the stuff that I did, in the media and talking to the BBC every month and presenting a television show and all of that stuff that I've done and continue to do in a way, the one thing I've been banging on about, that I've been wanting to talk about, is GRA reform. And I feel like I've wasted my time, because actually GRA reform maybe isn't the very biggest issue facing the trans community, because that is, hostility and a lack of treatment and a lack of being taken seriously and discrimination and all sorts of other things that are just as important, and indeed for many members of the community are more important than being able to get that certificate. Now, it's important, and you have to get it for certain sets of circumstances, like if you want to get married, for example, or, if the worst happens and you die without the GRC, your death certificate will record you as your gender assigned at birth. So, there's all of this stuff, but it doesn't really feel like, it certainly doesn't feel like we've won that at any point. Yes, legal recognition is absolutely important, but there's all these other things as well, that when the GRA consultation was launched, that all of the oxygen was being taken up by the anti-trans people, screaming about how this would usher in the collapse of civilization and all the other stuff they said. And it just became exhausting to even think about GRA reform. And I wonder if that was part of the TERF / anti-trans fascist people, might have been part of the strategy, really. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. It seems important, and it does seem like, because it is an important issue, of course it is, but equally lots of time is being spent thinking about it and talking about it, when actually maybe what the Scottish Parliament could be doing is looking at the NHS stuff in Scotland specifically, and increasing the number of clinics that might be available, making certain things easier to access. And that's not to say that legal recognition can just fall by the wayside, because it is important, but there are other things that we've been fighting for that they've kind of fallen by the wayside because of the GRA reform stuff, which has ended up in England at least being a bit of a bust. Because all they've done with all of the information that they were sent is say, oh, well, this consultation was skewed. It was skewed by all the trans activists filling it in, and they've then decided, well, what we'll do is we'll keep the process exactly the same, except we'll put it online and we'll charge you only $5 for it. And that was their big thing, and as far as they're concerned, that's their concession to the trans community, and obviously it was nowhere near enough, and it's just... Yeah, so I have very complicated feelings about GRA reform. I think it's necessary, but equally, I just fucking hate the concept of having to prove my gender to a group of people who, as you've already said, you don't meet. This panel of randoms, a panel of random cis people no less, decide whether you are trans enough to be allowed to have a GRC. And that's just sickening. So I'd be interested to see what happens in Scotland. Maybe they can point the way. I doubt Westminster will pay the slightest bit of attention, but if you've got one part of the UK... which is part of the UK for the moment, doing something completely different to what the government is telling them to do, or what the government in Westminster is telling them to do, it's not really a good sign for the government, and obviously I'm all for that.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting seeing what Westminster's response will be, because based on what Suella Braverman and Kemi Badenoch and others have said and done about the prospect of Scotland having the GRA reformed for them, they're not going to like it. And that's going to be really interesting to see play out.
Yeah, they don't like it, and nor should they, and I'm not interested in their opinion, frankly, apart from... were it not for the fact that they're the government, but... Scotland are once again doing things right while Westminster are, pulling us back to the 70s, and not even the fun 70s with the flares and the disco. I'm talking about the 1870s here, because it seems like that's where we're going back to. Dragged kicking and screaming by foppish Etonians in red coats. Anyway, we'll keep following this as it goes through and all of his other stuff, so stick with What the Trans to find out more later. But to wrap things up... Our old friends at the LGB Alliance, the anti-trans hate group, which appears to be made up entirely of fascists, white supremacists, and people who do all of their food shopping at Marks and Spencer's, held their now annual conference in central London on the 21st of October. Now... none of us went and got into the actual conference, because I'm pretty sure they wouldn't even let any of us through the fucking door at this point, but a member of our team did attend the protest which was going on outside. So our chat with our team member Alex about what she heard and saw at the counter-protest is now. Let's play the tape.
Hey Alex, you just got back from the protest against the LGB Alliance conference. How was it?
Oh, the protest was great. There was so much stuff going on. There was music, there was dancing, chanting, police, action, all that fun stuff you typically see with the protest.
How many police officers were there?
There weren't actually too many. It only really got wild when we were at a specific section we'll mention later. But it was about 5 or 6 people, I'd say, maybe 10.
That's not so bad. Like when I covered the protest outside last year, there was something like 25 police officers walking around for the first half of the day. Then they all went away, I guess. I guess they didn't send as many this time. How many people were there protesting the LGB Alliance conference?
Well, there was quite a few protesters at the protest there. I can never tell numbers very easily myself. But it was like a good 100, 150.
Maybe 100, 150, possibly hundreds.
Yes, I'm sure there's probably videos out there from the other protesters as well, which can help quantify.
So, you talked to people there, right? You talked to the protesters there.
I talked to all the organisers, well, decentralised organisers, they say, from there. I also spoke to some of the other people who went. Some odd Just Stop Oil people, some people from Extinction Rebellion also joined in as well. And yeah, I spoke to a few people there. So to start with, I met the organisers. Then I went on to firstly meet with someone who was holding this really nice memorial to all the trans people we lost. That was another one there we saw. Also met this really nice person who said, "Oh yeah, I saw your Twitter post about you going to see the LGB Alliance conference, and we decided to go because of it." And I was like, "What? People actually go to a protest because I tweeted about it? This is bizarre. Something I did makes real life consequences. What?"
I mean, the answer to this may be obvious, but there may be people listening who don't know what the LGB Alliance are. So, when you asked, why did protesters say they were there?
It was basically, for those people who don't know, the LGB Alliance essentially want to cut the T out of LGBT to say they want to exclude that as its own separate movement, to move it away. With all the discourse online about the shit they do, about wanting to exclude trans people from LGBT discourse, all this combined to then help foster this environment of hostility towards trans people. they want to protest against that to let them know that this isn't right.
So you mentioned a little bit members of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil were there. Like, how many different groups were there?
There was one or two, really. I didn't really speak to enough of them, to be honest, but I think some of them heard about this protest, and they're already in London anyway, sitting on the odd street, road or something, and then decided, I'm going to head over to the protest at the LGB Alliance. It was mainly organised by the Trans Action Bloc, but they're sort of like this decentralised protest group who...
Did you see any signs that the protest outside was having any effect on the people inside?
I feel like there probably was a reaction, but from what I could see, it's quite hard to tell from the outside. It looked like there was a few open windows, so they had no choice but to hear the protests inside. The reactions from the gender criticals as they started walking out were like, the usual confrontational fashion. There was even this one person who was just being stopped by the police, one of these gender criticals, from actually going to antagonise the trans people who were protesting against it. One of them was actively trying to even force a conflict of some form.
Was there any tension between the protesters and the police during the day?
Well, from the 5 o'clock, it didn't seem too bad. I think the police were like, oh, there's the main group over there, just sat there. We've got the fencing there. Someone's keeping an eye on them. That's fine. The main point of contention was at one point when we saw a bunch of gender criticals head to a pub nearby, and some of the protesters decided to offshoot to protest outside of the pub. And the police didn't expect that, and they sort of brought a bunch of officers, and there was slowly a bit of a build-up of police outside of the pub, to the point where there was a few police vans that were about to come over, and in the end, it was decided between the protesters, this is more trouble than help if we stay here, so we need to head off. So in the end, there was a bit of a moment where it was like, it might, but then in the end it fizzled out because we decided it was more trouble than good to still be there, essentially. But that was the only major fun tension there.
Do you know, why did they follow them to the pub?
Because apparently there was some significant members of the gender critical groups there. Apparently there was like Maya Forstater, possibly, I think the name's Helen Joyce, isn't it? I can never remember her. At one point, there was a time when two of the gender criticals asked for police to escort them out and away, and one of them did have the telltale curly hair of Maya, but that's just me saying, oh, that's a curly hair, that fits roughly the description of who that is.
Do you think people were heard?
That's a very good question. In the end, it was a set of protesters stood outside. They're just homemade signs outside this big established building that seemed to be massively unlistening. It reminded me of like the homemade signs, and it reminded me of the rebels against the evil empire, of this established large amount of resources where it probably won't listen. And a lot of the people who came to the conference when they were coming out did not seem receptive to the protesters at all. So I don't know whether anyone listened, or if anything, the only people who really noticed were the bystanders who were walking past doing their everyday stuff. But aside from that, whenever I look at this whole situation of trans rights activism and gender criticals, it seems just like World War One, where we're all entrenched in the same position of shit thrown at each other. So, with very little movement, so it's hard to tell, really.
Fair enough. Well, thanks for going on, Alex. Well, that's that. And speaking of things trans people were protesting this week, we come to our nice chunky meat.
Yes, indeed. And for our nice, delicious, chunky meat this week, we're going to talk about something that may become a lot more troublesome here in the UK quite soon. Protests. Now, the freedom to protest and to gather for political or ethical purposes is under threat from this absolute mess of a government. But as queer and trans people, you could say we actually have quite a lot of stuff to be upset about. We've been talking to trans people involved in a variety of protest movements, starting with what is, or perhaps should be, the biggest issue of our times. It's something that affects all of us, and I don't just mean trans people, I mean literally everybody in the entire world. Yes, that's right. We as a podcast are finally talking about climate change. Now, one of our roving reporters was at a recent Extinction Rebellion protest in London and spoke to a few people about why they were there, why they became involved with XR, and what prompted them to do so. So first up, we have Shana from XR Scientists.
My name's Shana. My background's in applied physics and space engineering. I'm here at the protest because, well, obviously we are sleepwalking into a catastrophic climate crisis, and we need the government and the government of the UK and the governments of the world to act in the interest of the people, to not only try and mitigate the worst of the climate crisis, but also, start to adapt our society and things, because for the impact that's already going to start happening, and it already has started happening. We had 40-degree heat waves in London recently, and we're having droughts and we're having floods. And specifically, I've joined Scientists of XR because I feel like the public tend to trust scientists a lot. They have a perception, I think, of activism as, hippies or, things like that. And, we need people from every single walk of life in this fight. So visually, we're trying to get scientists together to stand up and say, they're right, enough is enough. We need to stand up for the planet and stand up for the people. And I wanted to be part of that. And specifically, Extinction Rebellion, because I feel like we have a very regenerative culture here. We look after our people, we come out for actions, they're very high intensity, sometimes people get arrested, but afterwards there's a sense of community and people look after each other. So you might get arrested, but people come to the police station you're being held at and wait for you to come out, and they'll embrace you when you come out, they'll look after you, they'll get you home, and then we look after each other's mental health in the long run. And I think that's really good for these kind of movements, because we're about, saving the planet and saving the people. And we want this to be a long-term movement. So we kind of look out for each other in the sense of, care and community in Extinction Rebellion that you might not get in other climate groups.
What would you say to the people that say that Extinction Rebellion is too disruptive? Because there's lots of people who say, well, I agree with the principle, but not with the methods.
Well, what I'd say to them is these people who say that, for one, what's going to be disruptive? Climate change. when your house starts flooding, when those 40-degree heat waves turn into 50-degree heat waves, that's going to be disruption. That's going to be death.
I just have asthma.
Oh, no.
London.
Oh, yeah. No, the air quality in London, really needs fixing. That's another thing. But what was I saying? And people who say that, they often say, oh, why don't you do X, Y, or Z? Why don't you write to your MP? Why don't you go protest outside an embassy or outside the MP's office? And the thing is, people have been doing that. They've been doing it for decades. Greenpeace, anyone who's been part of climate motion, they've been doing that for 3 decades. And it did not work. It just didn't work. Fossil fuel use only increased in those decades. So unfortunately, we need to disrupt. We need to kind of make people look and listen, because I feel like climate change is such a scary issue. If people are able to, they'll look away. They'll ignore it. They'll compartmentalize. They won't want to face it. And unfortunately, we have to scream and be like, no, you have to look at this. I know it's scary, but you have to look, because we have to do something. So I feel like, I don't want to disrupt. I'd rather do other things. I'd rather just quietly, do my research, develop my career, but we just can't. And I'm sorry to anyone who's days are disrupted, but this is important. This is bigger than just one day of disruption.
On the topic of arrest, I know that's another controversial issue about XR. Do you have any thoughts on that? Have you been arrested yourself, or do you stick to non-arrestable so-called roles?
So far I have been sticking to non-arrestable roles, but it's not, I'm not adverse to the idea of being arrested if it's for the right reason. I feel like arrests, we shouldn't be being arrested just for the sake of it. I think we need to be arrested in very impactful, meaningful ways, especially when a scientist or a doctor or a teacher is willing to be arrested for the cause. I feel like that's very powerful, but it needs to be in the right context of there's a reason that we did something that is arrestable. So I have colleagues who were outside of the Bureau of Energy and Industrial Strategy. They glued scientific papers on the walls of the building, and they glued themselves to it, demanding that they actually listen to the science and follow the recommendations and take the actual actions that the science has been recommending. And they were arrested for that, and I was quite near to that. And I think that was fully justified, the fact that they were arrested for that, because it was trying to tell people this is serious. This is so serious that we are willing to sacrifice potentially our freedom and our careers and kind of really put ourselves on the line, because that's how important it is. And I think, so I think I do agree with the rest, because it just shows people this is how serious it is. This is how much we're willing to sacrifice for this.
So what I particularly like about that interview was the clarity of the message that Shana was getting across about the urgency of what we're talking about here, but also the mutual aid, right? So they're helping each other out in terms of knowledge and in terms of actually materially supporting each other in terms of mental health and food and literal support for each other, which this movement seems to, very much take to heart and work into all of it. Its core workings. And I thought that was great. Anyway, and on to the next one. Shrumi also spoke to mother of two Kate about her concerns for the future and about her, by this point, long-term involvement in the climate movement.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a mum of two teenagers and I'm from the northeast of England. Well, I've been in Extinction Rebellion for about 3 years and have learned a lot from people in that group about civil resistance and how important it is. And, I've done many, many, many different things over a period of about 20 years to get action on environmental issues, and particularly climate change, which I now refer to as climate breakdown and the climate crisis. And none of them have worked at all. We haven't got the change that we needed, and I feel now we're in dire circumstances. And I have to kind of put my body on the line, like the people that I've learned about in Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, such as the suffragettes, fighting to get the vote, and civil rights movement, and Gandhi, and various other movements that use non-violent direct action to get major change. I suffer a lot from, or I have suffered a lot from climate anxiety, and just feeling really, really depressed that nothing's changing, that our political system doesn't seem to be recognising that they've declared the climate emergency because of Extinction Rebellion actions, but nothing much has changed. They're not acting urgently, and it's getting very late in the day, and I feel really sort of worried and urgent about stopping the harm, stopping the main causes of climate breakdown, which is burning fossil fuels. I know we're going to have a very tough future, but at least I will be able to say to my children that it wasn't as, it could have been a lot worse, and I did my best to prevent the worst case scenario.
Could you tell me more about Just Stop Oil?
It's another civil resistance movement, and basically we want an end to new oil and gas licences. There is a lot of actions taking place, roadblocks, a lot of non-violent direct action, because we want the British government to say no to consent to new oil licences that are in some of them in the final stages of consent, and will go ahead. And obviously, if that oil is extracted, then it's going to exacerbate the climate crisis. The new oil licences need to be absolutely stopped, and to do that, you need radical action. I knew I had to make a sacrifice of my freedom. You know, we had to do something drastic so that the media take note, and you get high-profile newspaper articles, and we raise awareness that these sort of licenses could be given consent, like now, in the next few weeks, and it's all very wrong. You know, I'm angry that say Liz Truss, our Prime Minister, used to work for Shell, that you've got different people in government who have connections to the oil companies, and to me it just seems like a corruption racket. And obviously they have had well publicised figures of the profits, the obscene profits that they have been making in the first 3 months of this year. And at the same time, we've got a cost of living crisis. People's bills are going up. They can't afford to heat their homes this winter. You know, they can't afford to eat. And there are easy solutions to this, and they're not being made. Decisions not being made that should be made. It's very wrong.
And what are some solutions that you would personally support?
Okay, so I remember watching scientists on Good Morning Britain in, I think it was April at last rebellion, and he was talking about how we have 8 years worth of oil in reserve. We don't need to extract new oil and gas. And also I would really, really like the British government to give the money that they have and they're using to subsidise the oil industry, basically, and the oil companies, and put that money into proper funding for renewables. I wish they'd done that 12 years ago when they came into power, and we would not have a cost of living crisis and being reliant on Putin and Russian gas, maybe. So if we use the oil that we already have to transition to a cleaner, more sustainable future, we could have energy independence, we could have tidal, solar, wind, geothermal energy sources, we could have home insulation, especially for people who are on very low incomes, and that would help them with their energy bills, keep them warm. We would have new jobs with building new green infrastructure, and helping the workers in the oil industry to use their skills to transition us to green energy. We'd have healthier children, we'd have clean air, we'd have less air pollution. I think something like 40,000 people a year die from respiratory problems and heart problems to do with air pollution. There's tons of benefits to stopping burning fossil fuels and stopping extraction of new oil and gas and coal. We'd have a livable future. At the moment, we don't have one.
Is there anything you'd like to say to people who are kind of interested in getting involved with these protests, whether they're prepared to be arrested or not?
I think one thing I'd like to say is that in XR and in Just Stop Oil, there is a whole network of people who do equally, important stuff and essential stuff. There's a whole load of people who enable people to take the non-violent direct action. For instance, in Just Stop Oil, there's always someone who looks after you in the house you stay in, who makes sure you're okay, makes sure that everybody knows where you are, that cooks healthy meals for you and sorts out beds and just generally, looks after you. That's absolutely essential. When we do a roadblock, there are de-escalators, there are people handing out flyers, there are people who come to the police station and wait as you're released after you've been arrested and give you a hug and hot tea and some food, and make sure that the legal team in Just Stop Oil know that you've been released, and You know, so many people doing so many different things. People in media, people getting the message, people writing newspaper articles. So many different roles that are non-arrestable. Please check out juststopoil.com or we all just want to stop oil.com, which is a coalition of different groups, and Just Stop Oil is one of them. That are all working together to get an end to fossil fuels. Yeah, and please, you know, this is the moment to get involved in non-violent direct action. You know, you're not on your own, you're acting in a group. I have not met such lovely, good, decent, supportive people as in Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. You know, I keep thinking of an Extinction Rebellion tabard that I saw on a vicar who was in Extinction Rebellion that said, if not you, who? If not now, when? You know, we've got to act now because we're running out of time, and we can't live in a world where the global temperature is 3 degrees. We're at 1.25 now, and we have the solutions. We just need public pressure on our government to do the right thing. And so I urge everybody to speak up and do something now, not later.
That was interesting to me because you hear a lot about the Just Stop Oil people and they're throwing things at art.
Yes.
That seems to be what's getting them in the press at the moment. You never really hear from them.
You don't, do you? It's all about, oh my god, these terrible activists are throwing paint on art, which is usually protected by a glass or plastic screen anyway. But
yeah, whereas I think what's most interesting is, it just sounds very similar to some of the reasons Shana was saying about why she's doing what she's doing. It's because they don't feel like they have any other choice at the moment. And that is terrifying.
That's a big mood, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, you know, as trans people, under this government and this level of press hostility, it can feel very demoralising. We can feel powerless. And, of course, the climate movement, you know, is encountering the same things because no one's listening. And the people in power are just dragging their heels while we sleepwalk into the destruction of our civilization. You know, it's just...
Yeah, isn't it great?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Isn't it great that, like, anything with the word trans written on it gets, like, wall-to-wall coverage in the press as one of the worst things that's ever happened?
Yep.
How the danger is, you know, trans anything.
Yes.
Without looking at the danger right outside your fucking window.
Yes.
What a load of shit.
I know.
To round off this part, Shroomy also talked to Kim at the protest. So here is their conversation with Kim.
Right, well, my name is Kim, and I'm a grandmother, and I have been an activist for most of my life. And this is the issue of our time. We've absolutely got to do something. I belong to the generation that screwed the planet up, and I've got to be part of the generation that tries to do something about it for the grandchildren. That's why I'm here. By the time the earth is too hot, by the time everything is really collapsing, I'll be dead and gone, but my grandchildren will still be alive, and maybe their children. And I've got to do it for them. I mean, it's no hardship coming out on a day like this and just standing around with people from Extinction Rebellion and talking to people and sharing what we believe. So I think it's just something I feel impelled to do. And I'm wearing this poster at the moment saying bearing witness, and that, I suppose, is what I'm doing, really. If we don't do something, the whole system is going to completely collapse. There won't be any earth to live on anymore. So that's why I'm here.
What kind of activism have you been involved in before?
Well, way back in the 70s, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. Way back in the 80s, I was involved in the peace movement. I used to go to Greenham Common a lot. So I've just been an activist most of my life, on and off.
There's a lot of criticism of Extinction Rebellion. People say that it's too disruptive and things like that. As a long-time activist, what do you think about that?
It has been very disruptive, but the disruption has meant that it has come to the fore. And therefore, I'm afraid, even though it's disruptive, it is important. At the moment, this particular day today, it's not a disruptive day, it's simply a festival. And in the recent days, the most disruptive groups have actually been the Just Stop Oil people, and they have been disrupting people's lives. But today's action is not an action at all. It's a festival celebrating XR and celebrating what we can do, what we should do. I mean, I do feel sorry for those people that have been disrupted, but to be honest, it's not such a big deal when you put that against what we're facing in terms of the collapse of the planet.
You see a lot of reporting about these environmental movements like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. And they're portrayed as, young, privileged, that kind of thing. You don't really hear from the members who are very much not Generation Z, do you?
Yes, indeed.
Well, now you do.
Yep.
Because Kim has a long history of being involved in protest and all sorts of things. And so I think that shows that the movement is pretty varied when it comes to its membership.
Varied level of support from all different sectors of society who have realised, and as I mentioned at the very start of this segment, this affects all of us.
Yeah.
Every trans person, every cis person, every hater, every LGBT person, all of us. Literally everybody. And it can be very frustrating to be campaigning about something that is so important that no one's listening.
Yeah.
Or nobody who's got their hands on the levers of power, at least.
Yeah, so with that, I'd say if you liked what you heard in those interviews, you could check the links in the description.
Mm-hmm.
If you were interested in looking into what Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil are about.
Yes, indeed.
Let us know if you liked what you heard. You can message us on all the things, all the social media things, What the Trans. Just search What the Trans. You'll find some way to message us.
Yeah.
And if you didn't like what you just heard and want to explain why climate change is nonsense, don't.
Yeah.
Don't contact us, because...
Yep. Write a nice letter and forward it to me, arse.
Yeah, do that. That is the better way. And moving on to our last bit.
Yes.
Because the climate crisis is not the only thing that trans people and cis people and all sorts of people have been protesting.
Mm-hmm.
Also this month, our reporter and video queen, Alex, went and hit up a protest taking place in central London recently, being hosted by the English Collective of Prostitutes and Trans Activism UK, who were protesting a group who were advocating for the Nordic model. Now, do you know what the Nordic model is, Ashley?
I do indeed. It is a model of essentially policing sex work.
Yes.
Or not policing sex work, as it were, but criminalising the people who buy sex.
Yes. Now, sex worker rights is not something we've covered a lot on the podcast. We have covered it a fair bit. And we have
it's come up.
a fair bit, actually. It's come up, and we have had people from the English Collective of Prostitutes on the podcast before.
We have indeed.
But the thing I think that it's worth stating here is that there is the sex worker movement, and that tends to be fairly trans inclusive because there's a fair bunch of trans people who engage in sex work. And yeah, you know what? I'm just going to leave it for Alex and the people she talked to from the English Prostitute Collective explain all of this stuff far better than I will, so let's play the tape.
Hi everyone, this is Alex. I'm with Carrie from the English Collective of Prostitutes. Would you like to introduce yourself, Carrie?
Yes, sure. Yes. Well, we are a network of sex workers, and some of us are former sex workers, and we campaign for an end to criminalisation of sex work. We also campaign for money and resources, so anybody can get out of sex work if and when we want. We are different ages, genders, nationalities, races, and we are we're pressing for the decriminalisation of sex work, as they have the nearest that we want is what they have in New Zealand. We are very much against any increase in criminalisation of sex workers or clients, which is what the Nordic model is about, because any increase in criminalisation increases the stigma and increases violence against sex workers. Everywhere they've had the Nordic model.
Everything around this. Exactly. So you said it was... what were we protesting against on the 15th, just to let the audience know?
Well, they were, Nordic Model Now had organised a meeting, and it was called Students for Sale. and it was supposed to be, which is shocking, of course, students of a sale in many industries, because first of all, because now grants have been changed to loans, so students are all, unless they're very wealthy, having to earn money in some way in order to pay their rents and whatnot. And we also we've always campaigned for loans to be dropped and grants to be brought back. So that was what we were talking to people about who went in. It was quite a small meeting. It wasn't a very big meeting. It was in the Conway Hall, down in Red Lion Square, a very famous place. And we didn't want to make a huge fuss about it. I mean, we didn't the people who organised the protest didn't want to make a huge thing of it because they didn't want the press to make a huge thing of this, of the Nordic Model Now people.
Get them attention and such.
Yes, they really didn't want any attention brought to it. So they were just at the beginning, that the meeting was from 11 till 2, I think, or 11 till 3. So anyway, no, 11 till 4, quite a long meeting. And so there were just 4 of us that went down for 11 o'clock. There were a few people still going in, but it turned out, from when they came out for their lunch, it looked like there were only around 50 people who were at that meeting. And they were mainly elderly, older people, lots of grey-haired ladies. I mean, obviously, people who were concerned that students were for sale, having sex work. And of course, nobody should have to do sex work if they, because of poverty, which is what it's all about. But in fact, the latest figures, I think, is from the NUS, are that there's 1 in 10 students who are having to do some kind of sex work, in order to get by. I mean, it's not always straight sex. A lot of people do just sort of do online work or stripping or something.
All that kind of stuff, yeah.
But rather than go and work in Tesco's for 2p an hour, which is which is basically our options.
Are you able to explain to the audience what the Nordic model is exactly?
Well, the Nordic model is essentially, it's criminalising clients. What they say is that they decriminalise sex workers and they criminalise clients, but that is not actually what happens. Sex workers it was Sweden that started it back in 2003, I think it was. And they, sex workers there found that they were still criminalised when they were working with others in premises, and landlords were criminalised for allowing people to work in their premises. And the worst thing was that clients were much more nervous when they came to visit people. That's either on the street or indoors. And so you really didn't know whether your client, the clients were nervous that the police were going to pop in. So you as a sex worker didn't know whether your client was just like a wacky guy and not a very reliable, nice person, or whether they were genuinely concerned about the police. So, it was very difficult it became much more difficult to suss out clients. And on the streets, in fact, at first, when the law first came in Sweden, the numbers of clients on the streets dropped considerably because they didn't want to be seen by the police. And so there were many fewer clients of women who were working outdoors, and they found they had to go with people who they would otherwise have said, no, I'm not going to, I don't want to see you, and, had to suffer more violence.
Exactly.
So,
it made their jobs riskier because of what happened there.
Exactly. And it's still the same. It's still the same sex workers are still suffering more violence. And another bad thing is that clients, most clients are just good, regular, fine people. And if they think that somebody they go to a sex worker and they think that they're being forced to work, which does happen, it is not the situation of most sex workers. It's fewer than 6% of migrant sex workers. The best research has found that are trafficked and forced. But nevertheless, some are. And if a client goes to see a woman who he thinks may be being forced, on another time, without the criminalisation, of clients, he might well have gone to the police and said, "Look, I've just been to see this woman, this in this place, and I think she's being forced, and I think she needs help. And could you go and help her?" Now, that doesn't mean to say that the police are going to help her, but at least he would go forward. Some clients have come forward, but they're never going to come forward now. Under criminalisation of clients, they're never going to come forward because they themselves are going to be criminalised. So, it's one avenue that sex workers who are being forced might have been able to get help has been cut out. So there are many, sides things. Anyway, essentially, it's criminalisation of clients, and it's a very bad thing. And sex workers all over the world are against it, and unless they're making some money out of it in some way, or else, and are really fighting for decriminalisation, like we are.
Exactly. So we were out there protesting against the Nordic model. Now people who are advocating towards implementing this system, and we were essentially counter-protesting against that, and also speaking to some of the participants at the hall as well, weren't we?
I think we were trying to explain to them, and I think that some people who are for the Nordic model are for the Nordic model because they genuinely think that it's a way of helping sex workers. And so we were there to inform people that was not the case, and not to get into any back and forth or anything. And in fact, we've got on our website, on the English Collective of Prostitutes website, we've got a document which is called No Nordic Model. And it's just, people can go up there and download it. And it gives, it explains everything about the Nordic model and the problems with it. And we were giving out, this document to people who wanted to take it. I mean, a lot of people didn't want to take it because they were, no, I'm for the Nordic model, I don't want anything else. But some people did, which was good. And, we did get into conversations with people, and we did talk about, loans and grants, that problem for students.
Not many people are too sure on what the situation is with how sex work is, the legal situation with sex work in the UK. Are you able to elaborate what the situation there is?
Under the law, it's not unlawful to exchange money for sex, but everything that sex workers have to do in order to work together safely is against the law. So if you work outdoors, if you are there on the street with your friends, so that it's, you can, when you get in the car, you can make sure your client knows that your friend has taken his registration number. So if there's any problem, we'll know who you are. You can't really do that. I mean, if the police are around, you really can't do that, because it means that the police are going to see you and they're going to notice you, and you up, and they can arrest you for loitering. Loitering is standing on the street corner, and soliciting is talking to somebody, engaging with somebody, and and it's very, very easy. The police can put you in front of the magistrates on the word of a single police officer. They don't need any other evidence, and they just want their word. So it's very difficult. And also they use civil orders now to move people on out of the area where, clients are familiar with you and you're familiar with people around. And they use these civil orders to move people on. So that's really bad. And it does make it much more dangerous, because then people have to go into much more small side streets where it's darker, and where there aren't people around who know you and are familiar with you. So that's the red light areas are, when there's a crackdown, it's really, really bad. And then indoors, more than one sex worker working together indoors constitutes a brothel. And, that anybody who is, and you can be charged. We've known people who have been charged with managing each other in a brothel. And there are prison sentences, there are large sentences for controlling sex workers and managing, and you can be done for managing just for having a little rota, if you're sharing your flat with people, whoever is answering the phone, doing the rota, organizing the advertising, putting the money in the bank. all that is controlling or managing. And, there's for controlling, it's a maximum prison sentence of 7 years. I mean, that's just for organized people to work together safely. So the laws are extremely draconian. And so the only way to work lawfully is to work on your own, which is, of course, much more dangerous. Clients know that you're on your own, then they are going to try it on.
Yeah, it's less of a safety net that way as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because of being alone and such.
It's lonely as well. It's very, also, you don't want to work on your own. You want company. And we've got a little video on our website. It's called Make All Women Safe. And people can look at that, and it explains, it shows how it is,
how it is for the
if you're
sex
working
worker
in, yeah. But anyway, the laws are very heavy, and the police have a lot of power, and they love it, and they do. Police come and steal people's money, and there's all
kinds of stuff there. Yeah, exactly.
Terrible.
So I suppose with that, the UK law is a bit of a grey area at the moment, and the English Collective of Prostitutes, and you're advocating towards decriminalisation.
It means, because we're criminalised, it means that you can't come forward and report violence. If you're attacked, you can't come forward and report violence, because you know that the police are going to be much more interested in looking into you, finding out what you've been doing, and trying to prosecute you, rather than going after the client, or whoever the person is who's attacked you, and that, of course, and people know that, and they get away with it. They think they can get away with it, and of course they do. A lot of people attack sex workers, and it's a very, very difficult situation. So most people, go to extreme limits to try and make whatever way they're working safe. It means if you're working indoors, you have another room with the door closed and the telly on, so that the client doesn't know if there's somebody in there. And if you go visiting, you make sure that you call up the when you get to your customer, then you'll call somebody else and say, I'm just going in to see Mr. So and so. I'm in at this and this address, and I should be out in half an hour, or I should be out in an hour, or whatever it is. And so that the customer knows that somebody else knows where you are, which is there are various things that people have to do to make sure that if they have to work on their own, they are going to be safer. But it's not ideal. It's it'll be obviously much better to work with other people. I mean, and most sex workers are mothers, mostly mothers. 88% of sex workers are mothers, and mostly single mothers, in fact. And so we as I said before, we do campaign for money and resources as well as for decriminalisation. And the government really has to reinstate social security. That was what, that was money that a single mother was entitled to, make sure your rent is covered and your bills are covered. And then you don't have to do that job.
Would you like to plug some things about the collective?
Well, people can get in touch with us. We have a website. We are on email. We're on social media. Do get in touch with us. We very much rely on volunteers to help us with our work. So if you're interested in helping the movement, strengthening the movement for decriminalisation, do please get in touch, and we'll work out how you can volunteer with us. We're based in London, in Northwest London, at the Crossroads Women's Centre, with lots of other organisations. So it's great. So anybody coming to see us, you're coming in, there are people coming in and out of the Women's Centre all the time. You may be a sex worker, you may want to come and volunteer. Nobody knows who you are or what you do. Just come and see us. Do get in touch and come and see us.
So about 10 years ago in the trans community, sex workers' rights was a big thing. And this is before the moral panic. Like, this is when I basically first came out. I think you'll remember this. Like, sex worker rights were very core when it came to the trans rights movement. Because, like I mentioned before the interview, there's a fair amount of trans people who engage in sex work for a variety of reasons. Some trans people because they enjoy it. Some people because they feel like they don't have another way to make some coin. So there was a natural allyship there. But then I've noticed since the moral panic, that has become less of a thing. And I don't entirely know why, but that is something I've very much noticed. Did you notice the same?
I have to say, not specifically, but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening. Just because I didn't clock it at the time, that doesn't mean it wasn't something that was visible. It just meant it wasn't necessarily on my radar for a selection of complicated reasons, which I may someday go into.
Like, it was more mainstream in the trans community. And then I think at a certain point over time, it became less of a mainstream issue in the trans community, simply because I think people may have been more scared to put the sex work and trans rights together because it would look bad in the moral panic atmosphere, maybe. I don't know for sure. So it was really good to hear that Trans Activism UK were organising this event with the English Collective of Prostitutes. And if you want to hear more about both of them, Trans Activism UK and the English Collective of Prostitutes, you should check out the links in the description and find out more about this issue if you're interested. And again, if you are all like, oh, but sex work bad, again, please don't message us, because no, we don't want to hear from you. But anyway, that's the end of the pod.
Woo! We got through it.
We did.
It was got through.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. I think we did it with style.
Yes, I reckon so. We usually do, don't we? So all that's left is what we have in the notes is the end of show spiel, which is where we point out that we have a website, which is whatthetrans.com. You can find us on Twitter at whatthetrans, Facebook whatthetrans, and we are, of course, on patreon.com/whatthetrans. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. We hope you'll stay with us and tune in 2 weeks' time, where we'll probably have even more depressing news to share with you. But until then, thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Bye. This episode of What the Trans was written and produced by Ashley Talbot, Michelle Snow, Shroomy, and Alex.
We'd also like to thank our Patreon-level producers, the list of whom gets longer every time we do an episode, which is delightful to see. So we would like to thank Sophia the Sixth,
Lentil,
Philippa Taprug,
Ramona Martinez,
Alitha Aurora,
Chagall, they them,
Clara Giuliani,
Amelia,
Kara the Asexual Turf Buster, and her trusty sidekick Jiggly Jubs,
Candy Cox,
Zeph,
Fiona McDonald,
Torikuso H,
Murgatroyd,
Claire Renshaw,
Ontologically Unjust,
Stevie Lang,
Stella,
Michaela Irish,
Cindergosa,
Rebecca Prentice,
Graham Mulholland,
Crazy Richard,
Dan Oblivion,
Georgina Young,
Ty Griffiths,
Florence Stanley,
Riley,
Helen
Chrissy Jarvis.
A dyslexic velociraptor feels blessed at witnessing the Spookmaster General's stunning performance.
Nick Ross,
Alice Chalkley,
Melody Nix,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Lynn McKay,
Nick Duffy,
C.B. Bailey,
Gordon Cameron,
Peter Kimball,
Wen Witherup,
Vic Parsons,
Tila Wild,
Vanessa Billington,
Rowan Littlejohns,
Desiree Markland,
Patreon user,
Vic Kelly,
Emma Doyle,
Catherine,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Coomber,
Karakin 12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean,
Lanos,
and Chris Hubley. Thank you so much and goodbye!